the parsha in a nutshell. And this is it. I don't know if you got it. Okay, so we have Parshas Bo in a nutshell. Bo means come. It's the opening, one of the opening words of the parsha. So the Torah, the nutshell reads: the last 3 of the 10 plagues are visited on Egypt. A swarm of locusts devours all the crops and greenery. A thick, palpable darkness envelops the land, and all the firstborn of Egypt are killed at the stroke of midnight on the 15th of the month of Nisan. So these are the last 3 plagues. God commands the first mitzvah to be given to the people of Israel. What is the first mitzvah? To establish a calendar based on the monthly rebirth of the moon. The Israelites are also instructed to bring a Passover offering to God. A lamb or kid, goat to be slaughtered, and its blood sprinkled on the doorposts and lintel of every Israelite home, so that God should pass over these homes when he comes to kill the Egyptian firstborn. The roasted meat of the offering is to be eaten that night, together with matzah, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. Of course, that's why the holiday, that's why the name of the holiday is called Passover, because of the Passover offering, which is called Passover because when God killed all the firstborn of the Egyptians on the night of Pesach, on the night of the 15th of Nisan, he passed over the Jewish homes if the Jewish homes were covered, had the sign, the blood on the posts and the lintel. The death of the firstborn finally breaks Pharaoh's resistance, and he literally drives the children of Israel from his land. So hastily do they depart that they have no time for their dough to rise. And the only provisions they take along was unleavened. Before they go, they ask their Egyptian neighbors for gold, silver, and garments, fulfilling the promise made to Abraham that his descendants would leave Egypt with great wealth. The children of Israel are commanded to consecrate all firstborn and to observe the anniversary of the Exodus each year by removing all leaven from their possession for 7 days, eating matzah, and telling the story of their redemption to their children. They're also commanded to wear tefillin on the arm and head as a reminder of the Exodus and their resultant commitment to God. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in a nutshell, like they say. Now the question is, what do we want to think about? What do we want to elaborate upon? And how do we want to apply this? So a good place perhaps to start would be the opening phrase of the Parsha, because it really has a broader theme. It's not just this phrase, but it really tells us more about what liberation is and what freedom is. So we're going to open the Torah reading, and okay, so this is the opening of the parsha. So we already read 7 of the plagues. Now we're starting the 8th plague, introduction to the 8th plague. Verse 1, the Lord says to Moses, "Come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, in order that I may place these signs of mine in his midst." So we didn't get into it this year, but we talk about it every year. The verse says that certainly toward the end of the plagues, God says, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart." In other words, part of Pharaoh's stubbornness could be attributed to Pharaoh, but at least from a certain point on, it was God who makes Pharaoh's heart stubborn, which seems like a contradiction to the concept of free choice. But that's another question. We're not going to get into that right now. And why does God harden the heart of Pharaoh? In order that I may place these signs of mine in his midst. In other words, God has a bag of tricks. He's got 10 tricks. What happens if the Pharaoh lets the people go after the 5th trick? And we have trouble. Then there's trouble because God cannot show his bag of tricks. So God says, Leman, in order that I may place these signs of mine in his midst. In other words, God wants to show that he can do these signs. Why so? So verse 2 continues. And in order that you tell into the ears of your son and your son's son how I made mockery of the Egyptians and that you tell of my signs that I placed in them, and you will know that I am the Lord. In other words, it's not that God has the tricks he needs to show that he's more powerful than Egypt, and therefore he hardens Pharaoh's heart so that all 10 plagues could be played out against the Egyptians. But it's much more than that. The purpose is that people should know that the Lord is God, that Hashem is God. So we will see those signs. Not only will we see it, but we're going to tell this story to the ears of our children and grandchildren. And this theme of retelling the story to our children and grandchildren appears both in the beginning of the parsha, in the second verse, but it also appears in the end of the parsha. Once the Exodus happens, the Torah keeps reiterating, your child is going to ask you what's happening. Why are you doing this? And you'll tell them the story. So the idea of not just knowing that God, not just our experience of God through the Exodus, but the ability to pass it on is something that the Torah emphasizes in this parsha. Now, one way to think about the concept of slavery and the concept of freedom is something that is written in the Kabbalah, but last year, I think it was last year, no, it must have been 2 years ago, it was a plague last year this time. I guess it was may have been pre-COVID. So we had the speaker, Rabbi Pinson, who came and he spoke about this theme, and I really liked it. So I decided I'm going to read up a little bit about it. And of course, everything he said is in the Kabbalah and in Hasidic philosophy. So I say, let's repeat it again, even though he shared it. If you want to think about the concept of slavery in the Torah and how did the Jewish people react to the slavery and where the process of freedom begins. So the Kabbalah says as follows, a fascinating concept. The Kabbalah says that as long as the Jewish people are enslaved, they're not talking. They don't talk. In the portion of Exodus, Shemot, the first portion that describes the slavery, describes how terrible the suffering was. And let's close this so I can see you. Okay, so the verse describes how terrible the suffering was. I'm just going to pull it out here. And so I'm reading a verse. This is right before we introduce the story of Moshe and the stories of Moshe reaching the burning bush. Right before the story of the burning bush, the verse reads as follows. I'm reading Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. During those many days, it happened that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned because of the work, and they cried out. Vaye'anchu, they groaned. Vayitzaku, they cried. Okay, if you're a slave, you can groan, you can cry. Wonderful. The outcry because of the work went up to God. God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. So what do you see from this verse? You see what the Jewish people are doing. They're crying. What they're not doing is they're not articulating their pain. Not only are they not articulating their pain, it's not clear that they're crying out to God. It's very interesting how the verse chooses to word, how the verse is worded. It says, the Jewish people, the children of Israel, groaned because of the work, and they cried out. To who did they cry out? It doesn't say. It just says they cried. Vayitzaku, they shouted. That's all it says. To who? Doesn't say. Then the verse says their outcry because of the work went up to God. God happened to hear the outcry. Were they crying to God? I don't know. The verse doesn't say so. Maybe they don't understand how to cry and what to cry and how to articulate the problem and who to call to. And the number one problem, and this is the deep slavery, because if you can't articulate the problem, you're never going to find a solution. Now, what is freedom? The first time the Torah and this week's parsha, we're getting close to the plagues that are ultimately going to bring down Egypt. So what's the key word? So the Kabbalists say the key word of the 10 plagues is in our parsha, the second verse, and in order that you tell. Uleman tisaper, verse 2, tisaper. Saper is from the word sipur. You have to be able to tell a story. The reason why we have these 10 plagues is because now we're going to achieve freedom. And when you achieve freedom, you have the ability to tell a story. What's in a story? A story is you define the meaning, right? You have so many events. How do you tell a story? You have to look at many events and decide what is the story, what is the meaning, what is the purpose. But the slave can't tell a story. Only the free person, free in their spirit, is able to tell the story. And spiritually speaking, the symbol for freedom is the ability to speak, not just cry. Anybody can cry, but could you speak? Could you articulate? And even more, could you find meaning in that story? And the Kabbalists go on, and they say the whole idea of Passover, Pesach. So we said in a nutshell, and it's true in the Torah, the reason why the holiday is called Pesach is because Pesach means Passover, and God passes over the home of the Jew and protects the firstborn of the Jewish person. That's why the holiday is called Passover, because God passed over the home. But Pesach, say the Kabbalists, also has another meaning. The other meaning for Pesach is two words. It consists of two words. Pesach, mouth, speaking. And holiday, so in some sense, it's the holiday of speaking. That's why if you go to a Seder, especially if you go to a Seder and happens to be a rabbi there, I don't recommend it, but if you happen to ever do that, they don't stop talking. And you come to shul the next day of the Seder, the rabbi says, the rabbi's kids say, my Seder finished at 2:00. And the other one says, my Seder finished at 3:00 in the morning. Why it takes so long to eat a few pieces of matzah? No, the idea of the Seder is, can you tell the story? The Haggadah, what is Haggadah? Haggadah, which is the book of liturgy that we read of the story, comes from the verse, V'higana telavincha, you shall tell your son. Because one of the most important mitzvot is the speech, is the communication. And the idea is that an enslaved person cannot communicate, cannot articulate what's happening, because he's being acted upon as opposed to finding meaning. Once you understand what the problem is, once you speak, you have to define. Once you define, you can already describe the problem and tackle the problem. And that's the sign of spiritual freedom. And just to take one more angle before we continue. So the Kabbalah says the same thing is within every single person. So every person, okay, before we go to every person, what is spiritual enslavement and spiritual bondage and spiritual freedom? Says the Kabbalah as follows. We know that God creates the world through speech. If you open up the book of Genesis, Vayomer Hashem Yehi Or, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, God said that there should be light, and there was light. God said that there should be a firmament, and there was a firmament. So speech is the divine energy that creates. Why so? Why the metaphor of speech? God has no body and has no form. So obviously it's a metaphor. So what does speech represent? So we always explain that what is the function of speech? Speech reveals to somebody else that which is taking place within your mind. So you could have this wonderful idea in your brain, and it's really nice, but nobody could benefit from it because you have not expressed it into the world outside of you. Similarly, God has the creative power, but that creative power is in the state of potential within God. Before creation, could God create? Of course he could create, just like he has the idea in his head. What is speech? Speech is when your idea that's in your head is expressed now in the universe outside of you. So when God's creative power goes from the state of potentiality to the state of actuality, when it actually creates, that's speech, that's revelation. So when we see creation, what we're really looking at is we're looking at the divine power in the universe creating. Okay. What does it mean, spiritually speaking, when we're enslaved? We can't speak. That means we don't see the divine word. We don't see the energy of God within the universe. We don't see the energy of God within ourselves. The speech is concealed, right? So we're saying, what is slavery? Physically, you can't speak, you can't articulate. That's psychologically. What does it mean spiritually? It means when you look around the world, you don't see the presence of God. You don't see the word of God in the universe. You don't see the word of God within yourself. You don't realize that you have the infinite energy of God within your soul. All you see is the concealment. All you see is nature. So what happens then? Then you're enslaved to nature. Then you feel that the forces of nature can act upon you and you can't push back and you can't break free. But once freedom means once you see the speech, once you see the divine speech, once you recognize the divine energy within the creation and within yourself, now you have freedom. Now you're able to break free from the limitations because you sense the presence of God wherever you are and within yourself. So that's the mystical angle of the idea of speech. Just to make it a little bit more practical, another 60 seconds on this before we continue. Says the Kabbalah, every person's soul, we have tremendous amount of potentiality. A person has creativity, a person has ideas, a person has emotion, a person has love, a person has compassion. Slavery means when all that energy is locked up within myself and I don't feel anything. I don't feel creative. I don't feel loving. I don't feel kind. I just feel like I'm like a stone. My heart is like a stone. That's a state of slavery. Now, what does freedom mean? If I could articulate, so what freedom means when all that energy within my soul is now released and is able to express itself. So the Kabbalah says that one of the ways you can achieve freedom is actually through speech. The Man Tisaper, the second verse of this parsha, purpose of Passover is to speak. Because when you speak, that speech actually awakens the dormant energy that is within your soul. And if you can speak it, you can articulate it, it will come out. If you speak words of love, you will start feeling love. If you speak words of kindness, you will start feeling kindness. And in general, the way to activate the hidden potential within our soul is to articulate that which we want. And if you can articulate what you want, you're going to achieve it. There used to be a book in Chabad floating around. I don't know how it got here. It's not a Jewish book. But the theme of the book is that you have to speak and you have to say what your goals are. It's not enough to write it down. If you write it down, it's still abstract. You have to figure out what's my goal. And every morning you have to read it to yourself, like a mantra. You have to say what you want. And this person, I guess he's a mystic. It's not a Jewish book. The person says, well, if you don't speak it to the universe will never make it happen. Okay, it sounds cute. But in reality, there's a lot of Kabbalistic truth to that. Because if I can speak it, I'm articulating it, I'm revealing it, I'm making it concrete within myself. And that's the first step to spiritual freedom. So that's a little bit from the psychological and spiritual angle of why the Torah emphasizes the telling of the story. Both in the beginning, the whole purpose of the plagues is that we tell the story. And at the end of the parsha, as we will see, it's reiterated many times. Make sure you tell the story to your child and to your grandchild, etc. Okay, so that's by way of introduction. Anybody has any questions?
Yeah. I just want to thank you for, I forgot, I think Rabbi Pinson was here a couple of years ago, right?
I think last year or 2 years, maybe.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding that it's really deep idea. And I think the Pasha even takes it even further than, or maybe he did mention that, because in order for you to tell it to your children, you really have to internalize it. You have to really experience it and then derive a lesson important enough to pass it on to your children.
Right. Absolutely.
So that's not only to universe, but it's something that you sense that your experience is relevant enough for you to pass the ideas to your children. So they not, first of all, don't repeat the same mistake, but that will learn from your experience as well.
Right. And it's not always easy to pass things on to your children. A person has an experience, let's say with Judaism, with any other spiritual experience, it's hard to find the words to articulate it. And sometimes we just say, okay, they'll find their own experiences, because it's difficult to find a way to articulate it and make these ideas concrete. But that's what the Seder is all about. The Seder is all about is talk to your children. Of course, we have to do it every day, but it's specifically on the Seder, speak to your children about what's meaningful to you, about what your values are. They may or may not show you that they're listening, but they're listening. And that's what the Torah is telling you. God, don't be afraid to speak. In today's modern world, nobody wants to speak to their children. I don't want to superimpose my experiences on my child. But clearly the Torah says the best thing you can give your child is a sense of belonging, is a sense of meaning, is a sense of being part of something greater than him or herself.
Thank
you. Okay, next thing we go to the negotiation. Okay, so initially Pharaoh doesn't want to let the Jewish people go, not only because, we alluded to this last week, not only because he wants the workforce, but because he doesn't really believe that Moshe and Aaron represent God. He thinks they have a few tricks. They know a little sorcery like everybody else in Egypt. So he's not that impressed. But as we discussed last week, I think we did, that after 7 of the plagues, okay, at this point, he realizes, as he says, as Pharaoh says, God is righteous. Me and my people are wicked. Okay, so we made that point. Now the negotiating of the price. So Pharaoh, Moshe comes to Pharaoh and said, "Look, we're going to bring locusts. And if you ever lived in Egypt, locust is literally a tremendous fear, because the locusts come out of Africa and they literally could consume every last leaf, and that's basically the destruction of the economy. And when they say locusts, Pharaoh's servants step in and say, "This is crazy. You better let the people go, because don't you realize that Egypt is going to be destroyed?" Right? Till now, it was cute. We have frogs, we have blood. It wasn't life-threatening. It wasn't threatening to our existence. This is real. This is serious. So God calls Moshe. So Pharaoh calls Moshe and Aaron, and they start negotiating. Pharaoh says, "Go take the men." Moshe says, "No, we're taking men, women, children, and also the cattle." And they keep going back and forth. So, of course, one way to read it is that Moshe wants, it's a great escape. In other words, they're tricking Pharaoh. Remember, they never really told Pharaoh explicitly that we're leaving and we're not coming back. They never said that. Why they didn't say it is another story. We could talk about it. We spoke about it in the past. We could talk about it later. But they never really tell Pharaoh we're not coming back. They keep saying we need to go serve God 3 days in the desert. What happens after that? Who knows? Okay, they don't talk about that. But it seems like Pharaoh is saying, keep your sheep here because I'm afraid you're not going to come back. And Moshe says, no, we're going and we're taking everybody. So let's read the verses. Let's see the negotiation, and we'll see, is it just a simple negotiation of who gets to go because Moshe wants to make a run for it and not come back to Egypt? Or is there a philosophical clash between Moshe and Pharaoh? So here is so let's read verse 3. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and said to him, "So said the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go and they will worship me. For if you refuse to let them go, behold, tomorrow I am going to bring the locusts into your borders, and it will obscure the view of the earth, and no one will be able to see the earth, and they will eat the surviving remnant which remains for you from the hail. And they will eat all your trees and that grow out of the field. And your houses and the houses of all your servants and the houses of all the Egyptians will be filled which your fathers and your fathers' fathers did not see since the day that they were on the earth until this day. Never had there been such a terrible plague of locusts in Egypt." Therewith he turned and left Pharaoh. Moshe leaves the presence of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's servants say this is crazy. Pharaoh's servants, verse 7, said to him, "How long will this one be a stumbling block to us? Let the people go and they will worship their God. Don't you know that Egypt is lost?" Literally, Avdah, destroyed. Don't you realize you're destroying Egypt? Thereupon Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, "Go worship the Lord your God. Who are going?" Okay, fine. You want to go? Go. Who's going? How many people do you need? 10 people. You need a minion. How many people do you need to go serve God? So Moses says, with our youth and with our elders will we go. With our sons and with our daughters. With our flocks and with our cattle we will go. For it is a festival for the Lord to us. Moshe says we take everybody. Not just everybody, sheep, cattle. Why? We have a festival. Festival. You need to have meat. Okay, you need sheep. Pharaoh says, not a good idea. 10. So Pharaoh said to them, "So may the Lord be with you, just as I will let you and your young children out. See that evil is before your faces. If I let you all out the way you wanted, we can tell that what you want is evil. You're not being honest. Therefore," he says, "not so. Let the men go now and worship the Lord, for that is what you request." And he chased them out from before Pharaoh. And the negotiation continues at the next plague. What is happening here? Pharaoh says, just the men should go because that's what you want. Pharaoh is telling Moshe what Moshe wants. What's happening here? So there's a fascinating commentary that says as follows. What's happening here is not just the negotiation, how many of us can have a 3-day break from the labor and go serve God in the desert. What's happening here really is the clash between Pharaoh and Moshe stems from a much deeper clash. And the clash is a clash of cultures. What is the meaning of serving God? Who serves God? How do you serve God? So for Pharaoh, serving God is an intellectual, spiritual experience. You have to philosophize. Egypt was advanced in philosophy of the times. So they say, who serves God? The men serve God. The children just distract. You ever took kids to shul? They sit and make noise. It makes all the old men upset. Okay, so they say, who serves God? Only men, and that's what the verse says. If you look back at the story, I'll open it up where he says in verse 8, and he said to them, "Go worship the Lord your God." Who are going? So one way to read this is, let's look around at other cultures. Who serves God? It's the men. Says Moshe, no. With us, we serve God differently. Our idea of serving God is not a question for the men. Our idea of serving God, we must have the family. Serving God is men, women, children, old, young, everybody together. Why? The children can't meditate. The children can't philosophize. The children can't go on, what do they call those? A meditation retreat. So why are you taking the children? So what does Moshe say? Ki chag la'Hashem lanu, because it's a festival to God for us. In other words, our idea of serving God is a festival. It's joy. And you can't be joyous if you don't have your whole family together with you. That's what Moshe says. We need everybody because we make a festival. Our way of serving God is a chag, is a holiday, is a festival. Pharaoh says that's impossible. Pharaoh says, Pharaoh said to them, so may the Lord do with you, just as I will let you and your young children out. No, that's wrong verse. No, not so. Let the men go now and worship the Lord, for that is what you request. What is he saying? He's saying this business of joy, you made that up. God never asked you. You've been telling me the last 7 plagues that God came to you and God said, let my people go and worship me in the desert. I'm willing to do what God wants. God wants people to worship him. Who worships him? The men. Now you're telling me that you want a festival? You're telling me you want a party? You're telling me you want joy? You need the kids there and you need the meat there and you need all the excitement there? He says, that's not what God wants. That's what you want. And he chases them out of Pharaoh because he doesn't understand that that's the way you serve God. Of course, that's not the way the Egyptians serve God, but that is the way the Jews serve God. And that's why the first form of ritual that people will do as they leave Egypt is the Passover Seder. What's the Passover Seder? Gather together with your family in your house, and that's where you experience the holiness of serving God. Right? So in other words, with the Jewish people, it is a festival and it is family, and that's the foundation of our peoplehood, and that's what Pharaoh cannot understand, and that's why Pharaoh misunderstands what the Jewish people are trying to say, and therefore he thinks it's a trick, and he doesn't let them go. But what you see here, you get insight into Pharaoh's idea of what serving God is, and on the contrary, the Jewish idea of what it means to serve God.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Is this a continuation of the theme to telling the story to the children? So you
Good point.
You take the children with you.
That's a good point. So you have to take your children with you because the way we serve God is we don't serve God as individuals, we serve God as a family. And you will see that clearly when we talk about the Paschal offering, the ritual of the Paschal offering that we have here spelled out in chapter 12 of this parsha. There, the emphasis on family is very strong. So why do you need family? Again, it all depends on what the service of God means. So in most cultures, service of God means retreating from the physical. If you could meditate, if you could separate from the physical and focus on the spiritual, that's when you serve God. And therefore, family is a distraction. And therefore, you may have heard that there are other faiths that don't want their clergy to marry. Why? Because really, when you're married, what does that do? It distracts you. You have children. It distracts you from the ability to be able to unite with God. How could you be married to God? How could you be connected to God if you have to worry about feeding your kids supper? So they understand true relationship with God to be exclusive, and marriage and family to be a contradiction. What is Judaism's idea of marriage? So the most beautiful, a very beautiful law that you have about Yom Kippur. So you have the high priest on Yom Kippur, and on Yom Kippur, the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. So this is sort of the most spiritual time of the year and the most spiritual place in the world, which is the Temple Mountain, but not just the Temple Mountain, but the place of the Ark, the Holy of Holies. So you have the holiest day of the year, the holiest man, in other words, the one representative of all the Jews. So he's the high priest, symbol of the holiest amongst us. And then you have the holiest space. So you have time, space, and person. What do we know about the high priest on Yom Kippur? So the law is the high priest must be married. Must be married. Why does he have to be married? So there's a verse, he has to make a confession for him and his household. So the Talmud says he has to be married, to the extent that there's an opinion, minority opinion, but it's an opinion in the Mishnah, that you have to designate a second wife for the high priest. Why? Who knows? Maybe the morning of Yom Kippur, his wife will die, and then there'll be no service because you must have a married high priest. You're gonna have to start looking for a shidduch for the high priest Yom Kippur morning. You're not going to have time to make a good match. So they say, you know what? We need a backup match. Of course, he doesn't marry her. He doesn't. Polygamy wasn't encouraged. But you have us. You designate another woman. If his wife dies, you have another backup wife. The rabbis say don't do it. It doesn't make sense because then if you're worried that the first wife may die, maybe the second wife will die too. Maybe you need a third backup. There's no end. Ain't no ever stuff. There's no end. But you're all laughing. What's so funny? It just shows that there's no way the high priest can go into the Holy of Holies as a representative of the people if he's not married. That's completely different than when other faiths are telling you that if you're not married, you're liberated from the confines of the material. You're liberated and you're free, and now your soul can soar upward. Okay, because that's not what Judaism is about. Judaism is not retreating from life. Judaism is bringing the holiness and sanctifying life. And therefore, if you don't have your kids and you don't have a wife, you're missing the point. In the sense that you're not bringing the holy, you're not a symbol of the one who can actually bring holiness into society. And they're very good, Vicky. That's part of this big picture here that we don't. It's not the men going alone. It's the whole family. It's a festival to God. And like I said, we'll see it when we comes to the Korban Pesach, to the Paschal offering, where it has to be done as a family. There's no way you can do this alone. Okay. So let's go back to the Parsha a little bit, and we'll read about we'll read the end of the 9th plague, and we have the end of the 9th plague, and we have the end of the 9th plague, and we have the warning of the 10th plague. So this is very dramatic. Moses said, "So said the Lord, at the dividing point of the night, at midnight, I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, etc., etc." And Moshe says, "You're going to come to me, and you're going to ask me, and you're going to tell me to leave, and only then I will leave." And Moshe exited from Pharaoh with the burning anger. Verse 8. And we have the conclusion. The Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh will not heed you in order to increase our miracles in the land of Egypt." And now verse 10 is sort of a summary. Moses and Aaron had performed all these miracles before Pharaoh, but the Lord strengthened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel out of his land. Conclusion, sort of a conclusion. We have nine plagues, and then the warning of the 10th. Now, what happens now? So what's the next step in the story? Tell me about the 10th plague. No. Now we shift. What's the shift? Now we have to focus on the Jewish people. The question is, you can get rid of Pharaoh. You can destroy the oppressor. But how are you going to make the people themselves free? And that's the question that chapter 12 addresses. In other words, it's the Jewish people's preparation for the Exodus. In other words, how do you make a people free? That's really the question. And we have all kinds of interesting commandments in chapter 12, beginning with the first commandment in the Torah to the Jewish people. right? There is commandments in the book of Genesis. For example, there's a commandment for Abraham and his children to circumcise. But that's not necessarily specific for the Jewish people. It's more for the family. And they weren't a people then. It was only Abraham. But now a commandment to the Jewish people is, the first one is to set a calendar. We'll read that in chapter 1 and verse 1 and 2. And then once we have a calendar, God could say, on the 10th day of the month, take your sheep, and on the 14th day of the month, you slaughter the sheep, and the night of the 15th is going to be the night of the Exodus. But how could God mark the calendar if he doesn't have a calendar? So it starts with a calendar. And that's what Exodus chapter 12 says, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be to you the head of the months. To you it shall be the first of the months of the year. So without getting too bogged down into the details, what's happening is that the month of Passover, the month of Nisan, which usually is about April, but the Hebrew month is the month that is the first month. So we are a complicated people. We're the only people in the world that I know of that don't celebrate the new year on the first month. January 1st happens to be the new year, and it's the first day of the new year of month number 1. The Jewish people, no. Our new year is the first of the 7th month. How does that work? Only Jewish people can come up with that one. New Year's is the first of the 7th month. In fact, the Torah doesn't even refer to it as New Year's. Rosh Hashanah is the first of the 7th month. What is the first month? The first month, of course, is the month of the Exodus. So that's the first thing where we say how we tell time. Another thing the Torah says, and the rabbis point out, talk about this at great length, that the word month, the Hebrew word is hachodesh. What does month mean? What is the etymology of month? I don't know, maybe moon. I should know this. But in Hebrew, the etymology of month, chodesh, the etymology is moon. I'm sorry, is renewal. HaChodesh is chadash, new. What is a month? A month is new. What's new about the month? The new moon, right? Because a month is approximately 30 days, 29 and a half days, which is the cycle of the moon around the earth. So when you see the new moon, that's the beginning of the new month. It happened to be at that point, it was the beginning of the first month. So Rashi says like this, quotes the sages, HaChodesh hazeh. Chodesh is new. Zeh is this. In Hebrew, biblical Hebrew certainly, when you say this, it means first person. It means something you can point out and show. So God shows Moshe and Aaron, shows them the moon, and he says, when you see the new moon, and you see the rebirth of the moon, then you should know that's Rosh Chodesh, that's the first of the month. And this one is the first of all the months. So that's the calendar. So that one phrase encapsulates is short for God really telling Moshe everything he needs to know about the laws of the Hebrew calendar. And then he says, speak to the entire community of Israel, saying on the 10th of this month that each one take a lamb for each parental home, a lamb for each household, and everybody has to be part of a Paschal offering. If you have a small household and a big lamb, what do you do then? Verse 4. But if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor who is nearest to his house shall take one according to the number of people. Each one according to one's ability to eat shall he be counted for the lamb. Okay, so that's what we talk about the lamb. And then what do you do with the lamb? We actually have precise instructions how to eat the lamb. You wait for the 14th day. You slaughter the lamb. You take the blood and put it on the doorpost. That's what we discussed in verse 7. And then you have to eat it. Verse 8, and on that night they shall eat the flesh roasted over the fire and with unleavened cakes. With bitter herbs they shall eat it. You shall not eat it rare or boiled in water, except roasted over the fire, its head and its legs, and with its innards. And then you shall not leave any of it until morning, and whatever is left over until morning you shall burn in fire. And verse 11, and this is how you shall eat it, your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. So we have to eat it in haste to represent that we're in a rush. In reality, they weren't in a rush because they have to eat the Paschal lamb by midnight. It has to be done by midnight. Now, they didn't leave Egypt until the next day, midday. So they were not in a rush, but they had to dress as if they're in a rush, dress as if they're about to run out the door, have your walking shoes on, have your walking stick ready in your hands, and eat it quickly. So there's the idea of haste is critical to this story here. So there's a lot to talk about, and there's so many angles to address this, but if you want to just sort of take the bird's eye view, usually we delve into some of the details. If you want to take a bird's eye view and say what's really happening here in chapter 12, you could think about it. This is really a question of how do you make of slaves, how do you make them a free people? The first thing you have to do, teach them to speak. Okay, but how do you do that? How do you teach them to speak? So the first thing you have to do is you have to think about the concept of time. And this idea that is relatively famous, people think about this, but the one thing a slave doesn't control is time. So the first thing we say is you take control over your own time. But it's much more than that. We understand that we are not Egyptian. We have the freedom to define time as we please. If it's just a technicality, God needs to tell the Jews what day to take the offering. So say use the dates of the solar calendar. Say it's big deal. Say it's April 10th. Has to be the first of Nisan. Who cares about the Hebrew calendar? When you get to Israel, you make a Hebrew calendar. But from the perspective of Judaism, the calendar is not a technicality. The calendar is a foundation, because the calendar means you tell time on your terms. And if you tell time on your terms, you define philosophically how you view time. And this is very important, because what's the difference between a solar calendar and a lunar calendar? So the solar calendar, you're looking at the sun. What does the sun produce? The sun produces routine. The sun produces cycle. The sun produces seasons. If you look at Noach after the flood, God tells Noach, I'm never again going to destroy the earth. You know what's going to happen? Never again will I destroy the earth. He takes an oath and he brings the rainbow to show that oath. But what does he say? He says as follows. The verse says as follows. Verse 22, chapter 7, chapter 8, verse 22. Continuously, all the days of the earth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. All the things that he mentions there to Noach, that the world will keep going, it's all things related to the sun, because the seasons are related to the sun, and so is day and night. So what do you do? And the Egyptians had a solar calendar because agriculture was very important to them. And if you're a culture based on agriculture, you need to have a solar calendar because you have to know when to plow and when to plant. If you plant too early or too late, you miss the boat, your seeds will rot in the earth, and you're not going to have anything to eat. So the Egyptians are, in some sense, worshiping nature. When you have a solar calendar, you're worshiping nature, you're celebrating nature. And nature is consistent and nature does not change. And if the natural order is that the mighty rule the weak, then you have slavery in Egypt. What is the first mitzvah of the Torah? Tell time on your own terms, define time on your own terms. Rebellion against the solar calendar. You'll see in a minute, it's not really rebellion, it's sinking. But for the first step, you have to create a lunar calendar. What does the lunar calendar represent? Hebrew word, hachodesh, renewal. The moon has waxes and wanes, but what it has in common every month, it can recreate itself. It could change. It's not locked into the yesterday's pattern. And in that sense, that's the message for the Jewish people. If you want to be free, you have to tell time in your own terms, and the story you have to tell yourself is a story of rebirth and renewal, as opposed to the consistency of the sun, which represents the idea that nature reigns supreme. So that's the first idea. So we understand you have to understand that renewal is possible. That's the first process for freedom. What's the next step for freedom? What do you have to do? So we need a Paschal offering. But what do we do with the Paschal offering? Could everybody have their own Paschal offering? No. You must have family to have freedom. What does the verse say? The verse says, let's see if I can share it. My mouse here, what's going on? What does the verse say? The verse says you take a paschal, whoops. This mouse a little drunk, which is okay. What does the verse say? The verse says, speak to the entire community of the children of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, let each one take a lamb for each parental home. Sel lebeit avot. You have to have one lamb per family. Sel abayit, a lamb for each household. And the rabbis explain you have to be a member of the household, of the Passover lamb. In other words, you can't show up to the Seder and say, oh, can I come and eat your Paschal offering? No. Before the day before the Seder, in other words, the day, a few hours before, you had to make sure you have a subscription to a Paschal lamb. And the Paschal lamb can only be eaten by those who were subscribed on this particular lamb. And what's happening here? So to make a people, to make a nation, you need to have a culture. In other words, it's not nature. Nature is the way the world runs on its own. But then what is a culture? A culture is the story the people tell themselves and the connections they make. So the foundation for a people is the family. So God says it's not enough to worship God, but you have to worship God with your family. You have to belong to a family. You have to belong to a story. If you don't belong to the story, if you don't belong to a family, you can't make a people. That's the first thing. Now, what happens if family is not enough? What's the next step? So the verse says, if your family cannot eat a full sheep, so what do? Oh, then you have to join with your neighbor's family. So what's happening? We're building outward. We have the unit. There's an individual person who has to see himself part of the family, but the family is part of the community, part of the neighbor. That's how you reach out and the circle widens. And only when you have that connection do you reach the wider connection of the wider creation, which is the people. So you start with family, you move to community, and you move to people. That's really what's happening when you talk about the mitzvah of the Pesach offering and the specifics of how it's supposed to be offered. And again, every little detail of this ritual could be explained and elaborated upon, but I just want to take one or 2 points and then move to the next point. What's the next point? The next point is, there are other points, but I'm skipping to the next one, is how it's cooked. Now, who cares how the Paschal offering is cooked? It can't be eaten rare, it can't be cooked. It has to be roasted on the fire. What happens if I look like cooking better than roasting? What does the roasting represent that the cooking doesn't represent? So there are all kinds of interpretations depending on how you want to read the story. But one interpretation is as follows. What does roasting represent that cooking doesn't do? So in general, cooking is slower because you put it in water, you can cook, it could take time. Fire, it's more powerful. Fire can, if you have to cook the thing quickly, you roast it. And that's why some of the commentaries are reading that this is part of the story of haste, right? We said when you eat your Paschal lamb, you have to have your walking stick, you have to have your walking shoes, and you have to have your loins girded, you have to have your belt, your walking belt. You have to be ready to move quickly. You have to represent haste, which is also the whole idea of matzah, which represents haste. And part of this is roasted meat. Roasted means I'm in a rush. I don't have time to cook. I make a fire, put it in the fire, 1, 2, 3, it's done. I can go eat. I can rush. What's the idea of rushing here? So again, all kinds of interpretations and so many ways of doing this. One way to do this is that sometimes, how do people change? How do I change myself from being enslaved to old habits, which is really, or old patterns of behavior or old patterns of thought, which is really my oppressor? Again, when we talk about Pharaoh, when we talk about Egypt, Egypt is limitation. And the Pharaoh that oppresses me and my limitation is my own issues, my own limitations, my own patterns of behavior and thought that I'm trapped in those patterns because they're familiar and they're comfortable. How do I break free? How do I grow? So there are different ways of growing. And sometimes a person can grow gradually. Every day I'll increase a little bit and that's how I'll grow. And that's one way of growth. But sometimes if the situation is so dire, you cannot grow gradually. There can't be a gradual step program. Sometimes you have to be abrupt. You have to say, I'm just changing completely, right? Should you stop smoking? Should you do it gradually or should you do it cold turkey? Well, it depends for different people, sometimes for the change to happen, you can't think too much and you can't make too many plans. You just have to go fast. That means take the plunge. You're going to sit and decide, should I change? How should I change? I'm going to spend the next decade trying to think about which path is the best path forward. Sometimes freedom happens with haste. When you sense that this is something that you should do, go ahead, do it. It's the right thing to do. Don't think about it too much. Just make the move. And making the move is not being chained by hesitation. Right? A big problem when it comes to growth, hesitate. Will I be able to do it? Will I fail? Will I not? So there's room for analysis. But when a person is trapped, analysis usually is not going to free you. It's actually going to entangle you even more. So the idea of the roast, the idea of the speed, it means the courage to make a decision and be forceful and not hesitate and not question, but move forward in the plan that you sense is the right path for you. So if you want to summarize what we spoke so far, because we did a lot of details, how do you make a free people? First of all, you have to teach people to think about their time differently. Then you have to give people a sense of belonging. That's family. Then a sense of community. That's if my family cannot eat the sheep by itself, I have to grow into another. I have to connect to other families. That's a sense of community. And then what do I do with my sense of self? Now I have to break free. How do I break free? I need to do the speed. Don't think about it too much. Take the right choice abruptly and don't hesitate. That's the notion of speed. And that's how we get to the Passover night. And that's the first big section of the Parsha. But the Parsha does not end there. Because even if you're able to experience liberation, you have a moment of inspiration and you break free of the old patterns of the behavior and you feel liberated, your work is only beginning. The work is only beginning because now the question is, how do I make sure I don't fall back into slavery? And if you look back at this, if you look at the story both of Exodus and the book of Numbers, the Jewish people keep anytime there's any obstacle, they keep run back and say, okay, we want to go back to Egypt. Why are they running back to Egypt? Because there's going out of Egypt and there's staying out of Egypt. And staying out of Egypt is just as hard. And that's why the end of the Parsha, you have all kinds of commandments of telling people how to stay out of Egypt. And just to point out two of the commandments, is the commandment to sanctify the firstborn son, Pidyon Haben. In other words, we're trying to create rituals that would continuously, on a daily basis, remind us of Egypt. And the other one, the more famous one, is tefillin. Every day we put on tefillin. The Torah says, why do we put on tefillin? So you can remember that God took you out of the land of Egypt. So every day when we put on tefillin on the mind and the heart, what it really is trying to do is trying to maintain that feeling of freedom, of connection to God and liberation from Pharaoh, and having a daily experience, a tangible experience that will be able to crystallize that idea. But the notion that I can have a liberating experience and expect that to move on forever is not the case. It takes a battle, it takes work to keep that real and keep that alive. And one of the things I need to do, of course, is tell it to my children, both in the story of the tefillin and in the story of the sanctifying the firstborn son, and in the story of Passover. The Torah keeps reiterating, your son's going to ask you, why are you doing this? And you'll tell them about the story of Egypt. In other words, part of this is not just experiencing freedom, but maintaining freedom for myself on an ongoing basis, but also for the next generation. And therefore, that question of how do I capture and preserve that inspiration is really the theme of the second half of the end of the Parsha. So this is the story in short, many details here, so much more to discuss, but I hope this was at least thought-provoking and could open up some avenues of thought. And God willing, in the future, we'll continue to discuss these thoughts and others, and we should meet each other in good health.
So beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Rabbi,
Rabbi.
if I followed you correctly, you were saying that one of the commandments about eating the lamb was that you had to be part of a family.
Yes, part of a group. In other words, it's part of a group. But the way the Bible says it, the way the Torah says it, it says it starts with a family unit. You have your family. You take a sheep for the family, and then if the sheep is not enough, if the family members are not enough, so you include more people. So it's looking at it from the perspective of the family. But if I'm an individual and I have no family, I have to join a family.
And so does that become the basis for the beginning of the recitation of this in the Haggadah, where we start the Seder by saying, I'm paraphrasing this and probably mangling it, but all who are hungry, come eat,
Yes,
come join us?
yes. Part of, so the only thing is, in the biblical times, you would have to say it earlier because nobody could show up at the Seder. You have to be subscribed to the Seder. So you would say it in the morning or the night before. But that's the same idea. And you touch upon an important point. An important point is, what is freedom? So the Rebbe spoke about this a few times. What is freedom? Freedom is the transcendence of self. I cannot be free if I'm just focused on self. I'm just enslaved to self. So what is freedom? Could I share with somebody else? So I cannot experience the Seder until I say, if there's anybody else in need, I want to share. And in the case of the story, I cannot share the Seder unless I say, I need somebody else to come help me finish up this lamb because I cannot finish the lamb by myself. It's possible that by design, the Torah says everybody needs to be signed up. And by the way, you couldn't finish a whole lamb because the Pesach lamb was dessert. There was another lamb that you ate for dinner and the matzah for dinner. So God says, here, Andy, here's a lamb. Finish the whole lamb for dessert. By the way, God forbid, don't leave it till morning. Because if you leave it till morning, you have to burn it, and that's a sin. So you have to eat it all in one night in your house with your family. It's a trap. What's the trap? It's a trap. You can't do it by yourself. You must connect to somebody else. That may be the point. That's how you become free. Free is going beyond the self and the immediate family circle. Transcend, go look for the other. If you can care for the other, now you're free.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Is it also like a model, because we're about to become a nation, how to build a nation? You start with the family and then you expand to community and then broader?
I think so. And I think that what's happening here is that sometimes some nationalities try to destroy the family unit to strengthen the loyalty to the nation, right? And that is a terrible mistake. And you see that it's not natural, and you see that it takes a tremendous amount of violence to implement. And ultimately, that's not Judaism's model. Judaism's model is that what is a nation? A nation is a groups of families. And even in the census, we have space for the tribes. We count the people as a nationality. We count people as a tribe, and tribes that consist of families, and families consist of individuals. So you need to have, even in a nation, you have to be able to preserve the individual families, the distinction, the distinction and the diversity of families. And every family does it different. There's no two Seders. We're sitting here, how many people on the call? None of these Seders look the same. Everybody does it a little bit differently. And that's part of the beauty. And that's how a nation is built, not by destroying the family unit as other authoritarian societies try to do. They say, well, if we destroy all other affiliations, then people will be able to be loyal to the state. And of course, that's not the Torah's model.
Thank you.
Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody, and we should meet each other in good health.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.